A couple of words of preamble, I suppose. We're moving, I think, a little bit, intention now is to move a little bit from the discussion of what would a work of art look like or function as or do to now the apprehension of an actual work of art. I think that's where we're trying to move with this. So, as such, this paper might take a slightly different viewpoint than others. Apprehension of very large dragonflies here. You want to apprehend that dragonfly?
Just grab them.
Send them out.
No, you have to just grab them.
Okay, thank you. And as such, this doesn't necessarily touch directly in any way that can be traced immediately to some of the insights that we've been hearing all along in this particular symposium. But I would like to tie a couple of things to it. First of all, I think that having listened and observed for the last day and a half now that art is an active role in accordance with a mature conscience, I'd like to posit that Bach is such an artist, and that his works are an act of his will in accord with a mature conscience. And I'd like to sort of contradict Marshall McLuhan, if I could, and that the medium is not the message. The medium is the way in which the message is delivered, and that takes several levels. First of all, I would caution you to not take everything I say at face value about the Bach cello suites when I talk about the structure and listen. It's for you to listen to on your own terms in some respects, though we will have a discussion potentially about what that means. And I am the medium of the cello suites that you will hear, and I'd like to say that Bach is also the medium. And it's not for the medium to decide the meaning necessarily. So just maybe I'm setting up some red herrings or straw men here, but that's sort of, I think, something I'd like to tell in the back of your brains as we talk about this. And so to the paper. This paper serves two functions. First, it forms a contribution to the Jeffrey Rubinoff Sculpture Company of Ideas Forum that we're having today and yesterday. And second, it sits as a companion piece to a series of 3 concerts that will take place starting in 3 or 4 weeks and going on through the summer, of a complete cycle of the Bach 6 suites for cello and 3 of his violin works for solo violin. So therefore, it's a bit bipolar, this paper, but it covers some of the history and provenance and structure of the suites just from a purely interest standpoint, those of you who are not familiar that much with what these works represent or how they came to be. And then it will also try to explore larger themes of apprehension of art, presented both by the works themselves and by their actual performance from the perspective of the cellist and the listener. It's hoped that the scope of this paper will resonate both with concertgoers and any other individuals that are interested in this. So Bach's 6 suites for cello have become in recent years enormously popular. I left out from the paper in the interest of time the fact that they were not always so. In fact, for 2 centuries after their composition, they were rarely played, unknown by anybody beyond the teaching cello studio, and were never performed in their entirety until Pablo Casals came along. But since he came along in the 1930s and made a groundbreaking recording of the works, these works are now in the repertoire of every major cellist. There have probably been hundreds of recordings. If you go to iTunes and type in Bach cello suites, you'll receive 1,000 hits. It's unbelievable how much these have been recorded and how popular they are. They're heard in major concert halls around the world and in minor concert halls around the world as well. And they've been performed at moments of international significance. Casals was a stalwart Catalan, and in the Second World War, well before the Second World War, when the fascism took over Spain, Casals was a stalwart opponent to the fascist regime in Spain, and Franco in particular, and then at the Second World War. And he refused to play Bach cello suites in any country that recognized the Franco regime, which extended to the United States. He was asked many times to come and play, and he refused to play the cello suites in the United States. And he made an exception to play one movement of them at the UN when he was in the 60s, when he played a concert at the UN, based on the concept that the UN was neutral ground. So he took a very activist stance toward these works. And Rostropovich, the great Russian cellist who passed away not too long ago, showed up unannounced at the breach of the Berlin Wall and played works from the cello suites at the breach of the Berlin Wall, which I guess really truly was the first sign of the Cold War ending, so to speak. So these works have become significant. Clearly they have a significance in our culture that seems to far outstrip the inherent importance of the works themselves. I mean, it's just 6 suites for one sort of minor instrument. I put here a little bit of a thought. One might argue that the cello itself has become a symbol of unity and brotherhood in our modern age. Whether that be from the stature of those greats who have played it, Casals and Rostropovich, or from some integral element of the instrument itself, is perhaps beyond the scope of this paper, but well worth pondering. And we will come back to that a bit. Despite the profile of cello suites and how popular they become, we really know very little about them. What you're looking at on the computer screen is one page of the earliest known copy of the suites. This was written, handwritten by Bach's wife, Anna Magdalena. And this is her copy of Bach's presumed autograph copy. It seems indisputable that Bach wrote these suites. There is a musicologist in Australia who's trying to claim that Anna Magdalena Bach wrote the suites because they're in his hand. He's ignoring an awful lot of evidence, including the fact that an awful lot of Bach's works are in her hand, along with being in the hands of lots of other people too, because there was an era of hand copying. If you wanted a copy of your works and you were busy composing something else, you didn't bother to write out a second copy, you gave it to somebody else. Your original gets lost. Well, we have Anna Magdalena, so that doesn't mean that Anna Magdalena necessarily wrote the work. It's not to disparage Anna Magdalena in any way. It's just to say that it sort of seems a groundless argument. What is less certain is when the works were written, or even why they were composed. The cello suites have virtually no ancestry or progeny. There are a few scattered examples of solo cello works from the 1680s in Bologna. There's a cellist named Domenico Gabrielli who wrote a series of 12 ricercare. Ricercare briefly, or sort of, can be compared to the word prelude, or the word fantasy, which is a word that's been added around a little bit. Fantasy and music is something slightly different, but not so far off. But these 12 ricercare are a slim volume of 12 single works. This is a collection of 36 movements that make up 6 suites. So this is a really, really significant package of cello music, and nothing like it has been done since. Examples of the solo violin works are somewhat more prevalent, especially from 17th century Italy and the southern German states, which does go a long way more towards explaining perhaps why Bach would have written for solo violin. Also the fact that solo violin was his own instrument, as well as the organ, so perhaps that. There is a title page to the suites. Oh, I should have had to scan it. It doesn't much matter. There's a title page to the suites that was presumably a title page stuck to his first copy that describes the cello suites as Pars 2, Part 2. And that title page happened to be found tucked directly after the last page of the violin sonatas and partitas. So it would seem that Pars 2 means that the violin partitas and sonatas are Pars 1. So perhaps these are companion pieces to the violin works. So, as I've said, the crux of the matter comes down to the unfortunate historical circumstance that Bach's original score is lost. So what we're looking at is the earliest copy, the hand of Anna Magdalena. There are a handful of other cello suite copies. Most seem to have been made as a way of adding the works to the private libraries of musicians in Bach's circle. If you wanted to acquire a particular piece of music, you copied it. This goes, by the way, for how to learn a piece of music. Mozart was very well known for hand copying Bach fugues in order to study Bach. It was considered to be an excellent way to study a piece of music, was to hand copy it for yourself. In addition, not all of the early copies appear to be copies of the Anna Magdalena manuscript, but there does seem to be a very complicated genealogical tree of manuscripts that exist, of the 5 or 6 that exist. Despite this circumstance, the cello suites themselves maintain a remarkable integrity. Despite nearly 2,000 measures of music, only a few instances of conflicting notation occur, and these can sort of be run down to just hand errors. What is far less certain are Bach's preferred articulations and dynamics, indications of which are enormous significance to the performer. If you look at this, you'll see a few slur markings. Those are the curved lines above the notes for those of you who read music. Oh, we've just lost it. Look at that. Perfect timing.
Just jiggle that.
Yeah, I know, but I think I had to point at it. So you can see that a lot of those slurs don't appear to necessarily correspond exactly to groups of notes. They seem to be a little vague. The very first slur in the piece, is that the first 3 notes of that measure? Is that the first and second of the 16th notes of that measure? And this problem persists, it continues. There's a definite lack of clarity. As well, there are no dynamics whatsoever. And for those of you who read music and you look at that, you're expecting to see some dynamics or even a speed indication. There is none. There's a title, and I'll come to the titles in a little while. So this is a problem for cellists, and it has a mixed blessing, this particular circumstance. On the one hand, authentic performances of the cello suites are very difficult to judge. What is authentic?
Let's get the bug out.
Okay.
Just leave the door open, you gotta grab that bug.
Oh, there's more.
What is it?
Don't squeeze them too hard. You want them to stay alive.
Maybe we should close my doors.
Another idea, Chris. It takes something like 3 years to birth one of those.
Man. Well, maybe we should shut the doors again at least so that we did get some air in here. So this circumstance has a mixed blessing for us, I think. On the one hand, it makes authentic performances that follow Bach, supposedly, by definition impossible. We don't know what he wanted exactly. On the other hand, it has allowed generations of great cellists to make these works their own, which has lent an intensely personal edge to any performance of the cello suites, and I think that may perhaps be a contributor to why these have become so popular. It's very personal music. Notwithstanding the lack of the autographs, of course, it's generally assumed that Bach wrote these works in Köthen in 1720-ish. He had the job between 1717 and 1723, working for a secular court. He worked for the count at the court in Köthen instead of for the church. This is an unusual period in his life. A lot of his secular works came from this time period. His instrumental works refer to the lack of religious texts, letting them an air of absolute music, though for Bach, I think that distinction was probably irrelevant. Are presumed to have come from this time and place, including the French and English suites for keyboard, Brandenburg concertos, the Inventions, First Book of the Well-Tempered Clavier, and many others. Several issues crop up to mitigate the presumed time frame. First, the works themselves seem to indicate a development of his technique. It's generally accepted amongst cellists that these works get harder as they go. That's somewhat true. Second, Bach seems to have experimented more freely with these works in terms of instrumentation than was typical for him. In the case of the cello suites, the fifth suite has an alternate tuning. He actually asks the cellist to change the tuning of the instrument, to change the A string down to a G, which is called scordatura, which is, by Bach's time, an obsolete practice, but Bach liked to deal with obsolete practices many times. And it also exists in a version for the lute. The lute version appears to be later, so it does seem that the cello suites maintain their integrity in that sense. And the sixth suite calls for a cello with an extra higher string, an E string. So this cello here has 4 strings on it. The sixth suite asks for a cello with 5 strings. This is a bit of a mystery instrument. There are examples. I have played a very small instrument. It was about this big in body, made in 1684 by William Baker in London, which was an original 5-string violoncello piccolo. They do exist, but they're rare. Bach wrote several movements and cantatas that appear to be a part for cello piccolo. Some people have argued that that was really a viola. Then why was it just called a viola? Why do the parts have some other designation? But there are uncertainties that we do not know. Some theories abound. The instrument was invented by Bach, which is highly unlikely. There was an instrument, for a while there was an imaginary instrument called the viola pomposo that people thought that Bach had invented to play the sixth suite, but nobody's ever actually produced a viola pomposo, so it's sort of like, if you can't empirically prove it, then where is it? A small cello called a violoncello piccolo, or perhaps a form of a small basso viola called a viola da spalla, and there's a very current common theory that the viola da spalla is the actual instrument for these suites. Again, I think that theory, too much has been made of too little evidence. Some have gone so far as to wonder whether the cello suites were written for the cello at all. Be that as it may, the weighted performance practice and the title page that says Suites for Solo Cello has firmly set the cello suites into the repertoire for this instrument. As for the works themselves, they follow a very specific and nearly unchanging pattern. This is that of the dance suite, the 18th century dance suite, a very, very common form of the time. Several elements were considered indispensable to this genre. Every suite begins with a prelude. A prelude is just exactly what it says. It's just an opening movement that sets us off. Many people have viewed the Bach cello suite preludes as being indicative of mood. For example, Pablo Casals has said that the first prelude was optimistic, the second prelude is tragic, the third is heroic, etc., etc. Often comments like that tell us more about the commenter than they do about the work of art itself. So we need to be careful, I think, with that. But it does seem that Bach was certainly exploring possibilities of the cello and what he could do with it in each of the movements. The first prelude, for example, is based on broken triads. This is a very, very famous prelude. You would recognize that if I were to play it for you. The second prelude is just the outfolding of a broken triad. The third prelude is based on a descending scale, and where it goes from there. The fourth prelude is an expansion of harmony through the range of the instrument and through its sort of directional leading, etc., etc. I won't go on about those, I don't think. The dances that follow the preludes don't deviate from the typical dance structure. Bach was not an innovator in any way in terms of structure. So each dance follows the dance suite structure, and each dance comes from a different national or cultural origin of Northern Western Europe. The Allemande is the first dance of each suite. There's a dance of German origin that tends towards being quite serious and solemn. Allemands are highly rhetorical. There's a sense of discussion or dialectical sense in Allemands, or a sense of proclamation in Allemands. The second movement is always a courant. You're looking at the courant of the fourth suite. And that, I think? Yes, you are. A courant was of either French or Italian origin. And you have to look at the piece of music to know which one you're looking at. Bach used French spellings throughout the suites, which was the practice of the day, but he wrote Italian courant. An exception could be claimed for the one we're looking at, which has certain elements of French courant style, which is beyond the scope of this paper. This is not meant to be an exhaustive overview of the cello suites. It's meant to be sort of just a primer on them. The third dance of each suite is a saraband. Sarabands are the slow movements of the suites. These are from Spanish. Some musicologists think they even came from Latin America, which gives a slightly interesting international flavor to the suites, even further afield than Spain. The saraband in the 16th century and 16th century was considered to be lascivious. In fact, a variety of popes banned sarabands from public performance. Perhaps a tango would be a way to think of it. By the time they came to 18th century Germany, sarabands had become slow and spiritual, which is an interesting direction for something lascivious to end up. Their most distinguishing feature is an equal emphasis on both beat 1 and 2 and a 3-beat time signature. The reason I mention this sort of detail is because Bach gave us so little information, we need to use every clue we can use. So if we know how a saraband was danced, for example, then we have a sense of how a saraband ought to go. So if we know that the dance steps of a saraband were to have an equal emphasis in the first beat and the second beat, unlike a waltz, which has an emphasis only in the first beat, that gives us an instant clue as to, well, perhaps a saraband ought to go a certain way, because there's nothing in the music to tell us. In the cello suites, the sarabands are the spiritual and emotional heart of each suite. Many employ sustained harmonies and multiple chord textures, double stops, that means playing more than one string at a time, which give a strong sense of melody with harmonic accompaniment. A notable example is the fifth saraband, which I will not play today, but for those of you coming to the concerts, you will hear it. The dances that come next are the only instance of deviation, but again, Bach is not an innovator. This is the spot in the typical dance suite structure that any composer would deviate. We have the galanteries, the minuets, bourrées, gavottes. These dances are the only dances that were still danced in Bach's time. So these are the least stylized of the works, because these were dances that presumably Bach may even himself have gotten up and had a little skip to, I suppose. And he's paired them in each of the suites. They have a da capo structure. For those of you who don't know, da capo means repeat the first dance again. So you play the first minuet, you play the second minuet, and you immediately go back and play the first minuet again. It's one larger piece made out of 3 sections. The galanteries function in the matter of intermezzi, that is to say, the sorbet course of a large meal. They cleanse the palate after the very spiritual and deep ceremonies and allow you to relax a little bit. And the final movement of each suite is a jig. These dances are derived from jigs, which came from England in the 15th century, and they again became French and Italian variants. Bach most often used the French style. The fourth suite is a little bit of the Italian style. But the thing about jigs is they're fast and they're fun and they're very virtuosic, and they close each suite. While the external structure of the cello suites is based upon the typical dance suite form, the internal musical structure is really what interests us here, I think. It's the language of the suites, the language that Bach employed to write. And this is based upon the concept of counterpoint. Put in very general terms, counterpoint is a compositional technique in which multiple melodic lines occur simultaneously. A vertical harmony, therefore, is secondary to the interplay of parallel melodies. Harmony is unavoidable. As soon as we hear more than one note at a time, we are hearing harmony. But in counterpoint, the harmony serves not as an accompaniment to a melody, but as an integral part of the overall musical texture and meaning. All the various lines, and there could be several, have musical direction and interest on their own. They're not subservient particularly to any other line. In terms of rhetoric or dialectics, more than one thing is being said at precisely the same time. I think those of you who might be aware of Glenn Gould's experiments in radio have heard things like the idea of north, in which he pretends to be a passenger on a train, and you can hear the conversations of everybody else in the train all at the same time. Many things are being said at the same time, things that are perhaps completely unrelated to each other. This property, I think, is strongest in music. I'm a musician, and I guess I have a bias, and I'm free to entertain arguments against that idea, but I think music, of all the arts, can most clearly say several things at exactly the same time, certainly in temporal time. An exceedingly important concept of counterpoint is that dissonance creates tension and interest. Dissonance are two notes that don't sound particularly nice together. This was an exceedingly important concept in Baroque musical thought. Rather than to be avoided, dissonance is the very material upon which the argument of a piece depends. Dissonance generates musical material which is then carried through to its logical conclusion. Resolution of the conflict of dissonance is the final imperative. Consonance is the relaxation or release from the impetus that has been created by the dissonance. In Baroque music, for those who need to know, is considered to be music written between 1600 and 1750. That's a nice, convenient package to put it into, but if you're thinking Bach, Vivaldi, Handel, Corelli, you're on the right track. In Baroque music, these events, dissonance and consonance, occur continually and in passing. This is not sort of a moment we're waiting for. This is the actual fleeting ongoingness of the music, moment by moment. Strict rules govern the ways in which counterpoint and the resulting dissonances are to be handled and resolved. Now, this is something I'd like you to really pay attention to. The concept of dissonance should not be thought of as subjective or even invented. Rather, what the ear perceives as consonant or dissonant is based upon mathematical relationships between pitches. The ancient Greeks, Pythagoras in fact, were the first to discover the relationships between certain notes. Intervals, which are a distance between notes, it's a measurement of distance, of the octave, fifth, and fourth, have closely related diminutions of waveforms that cause them to sound consonant. So, for example, A440 is a particular tuning note in Western classical music. That is to say that there are 440 hertz per second in a particular pitch. The octave below that note, is A220, 220 hertz in the oscillation of that note. 220 and 440 fit together very nicely. So they don't interfere with each other when you hear them both at the same time. So octaves, fourths, and fifths have closely related diminutions of waveforms that cause them to sound consonant. Sixths and thirds less so, while sevenths and seconds have waveforms, relationships that interfere with each other and cause them to sound dissonant. Notice, by the way, that the paired relationships listed above are also inversions of each other. Fourths are inverted fifths, sixths are inverted thirds, etc. Inverted relationships extended to melodic material is integral to the construction of counterpoint. Contrapuntal material may be generated by inversion, retrograde, backwards motion, retrograde inversion, and so on. This is to say that a composer can take a melody and choose to play it upside down, and then simultaneously put it upside down and perhaps an interval of the fifth away from the previous melody, you now think you're hearing two completely distinct, different melodies that have nothing to do with each other, but the composer knows better. And then he can choose to play them upside down and backwards. And again, you're getting farther and farther away. And you may think that you've ended up with something that is completely new, and yet the composer knows where the DNA, so to speak, of that melody came from, if I may mix a metaphor. Counterpoint becomes a layering of related yet distinct musical materials. The more complex the transformation, the less apparent the relationship. However, from the point of view of the composer in control of his material, the relationships are always both valid and present. At any given point in a contrapuntal composition, the relationships between individual lines of music can be expressed in terms of space, the intervallic distance. You can always measure the distance between notes at any given moment in the piece. The piece has a sense of space. The result is musical material, a piece of music, governed by mathematical relationships that are natural. That is to say, they're mathematical relationships that are discovered in the natural world. They just happen to be what life on Earth is like. Being manipulated by a composer into sound which is perceived to be art. Indeed, at its best, it's perceived to be among perhaps the highest form of musical art. It's fascinating and I think really apropos that mathematical relationships that seem so inflexible and even arbitrary can be manipulated into meaning that impacts upon human intellect and emotion. The key is in the relationships. Dissonance versus consonance, contrary motion versus similar motion. That is to say, music that's moving away from itself, or music that's moving towards itself. Closeness versus distance, that's intervallic relationships. Conflict versus resolution. Proposition versus dialogue. Counterpoint is profoundly relational. Bach is universally considered to be the greatest master of counterpoint musical history. I think that's a statement that requires no footnote. I don't think anybody's ever going to argue me on that one. Counterpoint is both a technique, it's a way of generating music material, and it's an approach to composition. You can choose to be a contrapuntal composer or to write a contrapuntal piece of music. Bach was unique in his surpassing ability to fuse both these aims into integrated musical creations. Counterpoint is often linked with the Baroque as an identifying feature of that era. As soon as we say counterpoint, we think about Baroque. Many composers of many different eras have used counterpoint. Beethoven used counterpoint continually, Mozart used counterpoint continually, Shostakovich uses counterpoint continually. Continually, I don't mean at every moment in their compositions, I mean throughout their composing life, throughout the body of their work. Even in the Baroque, not all music can be considered to be composed with counterpoint as a main structural element. I think that there are varying complexities of counterpoint in any given Baroque composition. For Bach, however, counterpoint was both his underlying technique and his artistic cornerstone. I put here Bach as perhaps the last great composer to employ counterpoint. Bach was the last great composer, so far, to employ counterpoint as a pervading encompassing principle. In fact, by the end of his life, Bach was considered to be composing in an old-fashioned, overly complicated and obscure style. The classical era was about to come, and clarity of line and hierarchy of material was going to become the priorities of the classical era. Bach's worldview and his sense of place in the natural order of things, I think, may be key to his dependence, or perhaps his insistence, on counterpoint. Bach was a child of medieval thought. He was born in 1685, and he lived at a time of great change in human philosophy. He lived at the beginning of the age of the Enlightenment. Bach was not highly educated in the strictest sense. He left school in his early teens. Though he was a voracious learner and reader, he had a very large library at his death. And he lived in a milieu that was accommodating to philosophical and theological thought, a pairing that today we often view as opposing each other, though in Bach's time theology was considered to be of equal status, if not in fact the actual aim of philosophy. Theology used to be called the queen of sciences actually. He even attended the same school in Eisenach, this town that he was born in, that had been the elementary school of Martin Luther. So I think it's fair to say that there was fertile ground for discussion and intellect in the place that Bach lived and grew up. He spent his life in service to authority. He was a musician for hire for his entire life. He was a public musician. His job was to produce music for certain purposes, not just because he felt like it. He worked for the secular court of Britain, and he worked for the church for most of his life in Leipzig, but in other cities as well. And he knew his place in the order of things in that particular social strata. Undoubtedly, he also knew his own worth. He was most certainly a genius, at least in the realm of music. And he was without a doubt profoundly religious. I think it's important for us to recognize that Bach's worldview informs why and what he did. Upon his death, his library contained some 80 volumes of theology. In short, Bach was probably as deep an intellectual, as rational a thinker, and as devout a believer as one could be in 18th century Germany without actually being a professional philosopher or theologian. And Bach was also likely a supremely serious thinker, in that he probably viewed the life of the mind and the exercise of the human intellect to be critical to human endeavor, integral to what it means to be a person. Above all this, Bach was supremely religious and viewed all of his work as offerings to his creator. What he offered was the best of his rational mind, combined with the properties of the natural world, the discovered world, the relationship of natural laws, intervallic relationships in music, organized into meaningful, coherent, though inherently complex structures. His music is ultimately relational to its own structure, guided by its natural musical laws, to his intellectual perception and control of his material, and to his own place in the cosmos. Counterpoint exists in the context of relationships, and Bach was the greatest master of counterpoint. An interesting problem occurs when we apply the concept of counterpoint, or Bach's specific concept of counterpoint, to the cello suites. Counterpoint requires the sounding of simultaneous musical lines, more than one thing happening at a time. Take a look at the music in front of you again. You really only see one note at a time, don't you? The cello is a single-voiced instrument, so that's what you see. Bach's musical imagination was necessarily restricted by the medium he chose to work in. We should not make the mistake in thinking that this restriction was a negative for Bach. On the contrary, I would imagine that Bach welcomed the restrictions inherent in writing for the cello, even while attempting to expand its possibilities. Restrictions, boundaries, to borrow another metaphor, are often catalysts to artistic expression. The restrictions posed by the cello became the mold into which Bach poured his musical material. Just to step aside briefly, in the 19th century, it became popular for great composers such as Schumann to write piano accompaniments to the cello suites and the violin works, perceiving somehow something was missing in these works. I think if Bach was not disturbed by things missing, why should we be disturbed by things missing? It seems certain that Bach heard the music in his imagination first. Thus, essentially everything he wrote had to be distilled to fit the possibilities of his medium. That's for all of his music. Whatever he was writing for, he had to make it actually possible. Sometimes in the cello suites, he's on the edge of possible. In the case of the cello suites, it seems certain that Bach heard multiple voices, complete counterpoint, while composing these suites. The process of composition for him then was a process of paring down, of leaving out much of what he heard in his head. At the same time, Bach had to supply enough material to maintain musical integrity of the work. For Bach, everything is relational. All of his musical ideas exist in context. Singular melody is almost an oxymoron in Bach's musical language and conceptions. Yet, if you look at that page, you think you're looking at singular melody. Bach chose to work with a singularity in the cello suites, a single cello with severe inherent restrictions in regard to polyphonic contrapuntal composition. Bach's solution to this problem was to include just enough material to give the impression of counterpoint. He accomplishes this in two ways: inferred counterpoint and deferred counterpoint. The deferred counterpoint is much easier to grasp, by the way. Through double stops, broken chords, and imitative motives, Bach has supplied enough notes to suggest a complete second or even third or even fourth voice in the texture. Many of the sudden shifts of register and the leaps across strings that occur continually throughout the cello suites are written specifically to supply an ongoing outline of simultaneous voices. In many places, the gaps between these voices, the gaps between the notes in a particular voice, can be very long, very significant. But Bach is actually uncanny in his ability to never leave a line dangling. He always manages to tie up loose ends. The remainder of the notes, the completion of the second or third voices, were no doubt present in his imagination. As a brief aside, they're also present when I teach these works. When I'm teaching the cello suites to students and play alongside them, I will actually play the inferred missing line in its totality. Bach would come into the room and tell me I was right or wrong, or he'd say, well, actually, I thought it was going up, not down there. But if you know the rules of counterpoint and where things are going, you can fill in the missing lines. They're there. Here we come to an interesting aspect of the cello suites. The inferred notes, those notes that Bach was obliged to leave out due to instrumental restrictions, not only exist in Bach's imagination, they also exist in the mind of the listener. I think it's completely unbelievable, almost, that unwritten notes, notes that were thought of 300 years ago, can be heard again today. These notes were not even notated. They were just implied, yet they can be reconstructed today. They exist in the mind of the listener. The deferred notes have to be realigned in the listener's imagination as the music unfolds. Essentially, Bach is dependent upon the listener to enter into relationship with the text, the music, in order to complete the text. In this way, the listener becomes an active participant in the realization of Bach's music. Predicated to this is an expectation, a requirement, actually, that the listener has the ability to comprehend Bach's intentions. And we have touched on this form of the need for a match between the consciousness of a perceiver and a producer, so to speak. Bach has relinquished to the listener control over their perception of his work, but the listener must be up to the task. So here we get into the various perspectives that I see that come to bear in the suites. The first or primary listener is the player. The cellist who plays the suites must strive to enter into relationship with the written text in order to not only understand what is there, but also what is implied to be there. Printed music in general, or handwritten music, can be seen to be an analogy. It's a blueprint. It's instructions. No music exists as it was intended to exist, as we think of music existing, until it is realized in time and sound. It's a sort of like a tree falls in the forest situation. Do the Bach cello suites exist sitting on a shelf in a library, or do they exist when they're being heard? In the case of the cello suites, there's an interesting interplay between the text, the realization of the text, and the inner realization of that which is not in the text. This is true in many other instances. I think that you could argue that this is true in all musical presentation, because that cannot tell a musician everything that's to be done. It's impossible to supply every detail and be accurate. But in the case of the cello suites, it's actually an integral part of how to understand, how to listen. Thus, the cellist enters into relationship with the text. Above that, the cellist gives life to the text in the realization of what it, the notes, represent in time and space. I don't think it's a large leap to expand that relationship to realization in time, time and sound. I don't think it's a large leap to expand that relationship into realization in time and space. The physical act of playing the notes, the expenditure of energy, the movements across and around the cello, they give voice to the counterpoint, even the occupation of physical space by the cello and the cellist, becomes itself a three-dimensional counterpoint in time and space. Of course, sound waves are three-dimensional. They exist in dimensional time and space, but we don't think of them that way. We think of them as something that actually happens sort of in our brains. We perceive sound in our minds and heads, but it's measurable scientifically. The physical motions of the cellists are definitely three-dimensional, and this provides a dimension that Bach himself was unable to provide without a player. The result is a work of art now functioning on several levels of relationship, or to put it another way, on several dimensions. Natural materials, a mathematical counterpoint. Compositional control of that material, the intention of the artist, Bach. The missing or deferred counterpoint, that's now been translated from Bach to the engaged cellist. And the realization in time, sound, and space of all these aspects by the cello and the cellist. The next level of relationship is the secondary listener, the audience, all the rest of you. At the lowest level, the secondary listener experiences the sound of Bach's notes as a perception of the brain. This can be a passive experience, such as if one hears music or any sound, simply because we're near enough to hear it. This becomes an active experience if the secondary listener chooses to listen. If you pick up on that one sound out of all the things that are competing with the bug in the room and last night the frog in the pond, one aspect here. It is more active again if the secondary listener also chooses or is in a position to watch the player play. Even at this point, this remains a lower level perception of the music. Understanding the intent of the notes may or may not be present. This might touch a little bit on what we discussed just before lunch. Nonetheless, perception is taking place. It is analogous to looking at a piece of sculpture. The secondary listener is perceiving something in time and space and sound, a cello and a cellist as a living sculpture, causing the notes written by Bach to be heard in the present. A certain level of relationship has now been entered into already. If the secondary listener, the audience, member, then chooses to engage with the living sculpture of the cellist performing, and begins to actively engage with the notes being perceived in the brain, internalizing and organizing Bach's text into a personal inner experience, then two or more dimensions have been added. The missing notes of counterpoint are now being supplied by the secondary listener's imagination. The text has been completed. And the connection between perceived sound and physical action, realized in time and space, are bound together into a single instance of the apprehension of a work of art. Natural materials, human intellect, inner imagination, physical space and movement have all combined to create a singular human experience, a living sculpture that occupies the dimensions of time, space, mathematical intervallic space and physical space, sound, and action. Three perspectives can then be identified as coming to bear on the cellist. First, Bach's perspective. He had the enviable experience of manipulating the natural materials from which the music is formed. And he could probably also be said to have had the most complete experience of the text, both written and unwritten. I think it's arguable that a cellist who has made long careful study of the text has likely come very close to that. I can think of instances perhaps where a musician has exceeded a composer's knowledge of the text. It happens all the time if you're a musician. If you've spent 20 years playing a Beethoven string quartet that Beethoven took 3 weeks to write and never looked at again, you may well have exceeded Beethoven's knowledge of his own text. Bach has also had, through his own worldview, the perception of his own creation set into his own comprehension of the natural world, his own worldview, how he viewed nature and the existence, the essence of existence, and the relationships, dimensions that the music represented. The natural relationships it represented, and also the spiritual relationships that his own work represented through his own worldview. Second is the performer's perspective. The cellist experiences the text in a manner approaching Bach's own, but without the primary privilege of manipulating the actual music materials that comprise the text. The cellist is obliged to keep to the notes as written by Bach. But the cellist does have the proprietary privilege of interpreting those notes, presenting them in a manner which, one hopes, is as authentic to the implied expectations of the text as possible. As well, the cellist experiences the physical actions required to realize Bach's creation in time and space, and the exhaustion, I might add, that occurs after the fact. In a way, the cellist embodies the music through the act of playing it. Third, the secondary listener's perspective. That's the audience member. With enough attention, understanding, and knowledge of the notes, the secondary listener also approaches the level of understanding of the text shared by both Bach and the cellist, including the inner manifestation of the unwritten counterpoint. If you listen to these works repeatedly, you know them much better than you did your first time. That's an obvious example of building knowledge of the music. As well, the secondary listener experiences the perception of the physical embodiment of the text into a moment of time and space. The secondary listener, in fact, is the most privileged to experience the cello suites as living sculpture. You actually get to observe the act of them being realized, which I only get to observe through proprioception. These perspectives can and do change. The cellist who has played the suites may find themselves as a secondary listener in another's performance, while the secondary listener may become a cellist, or is a cellist, who has played the suites. Bach himself may have had all three of these experiences. He wrote them, he certainly heard cellists play these works, I would imagine, and he may have even played them himself, perhaps in the viola da spalla. In all instances, a triangular relationship of composer, performer, and listener combined to complete the many dimensions embedded in the cello suites. That is to say, too, in terms of the self-consciousness, the consciousness of the self and the group, I think this ties in quite nicely, actually. One last line of inquiry remains. Why have the cello suites come to occupy such an exalted position? Really, in the grand scheme of things, this is not particularly important music. This is not Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. This is just a collection of stuff for some cellists to go play. So why do they now seem to be so exalted in Western music? If you ask a music lover what instrument they love, the chances are good they'll tell you the cello. If you ask them what cello pieces they like, chances are good they'll tell you the Bach cello suites. But why is that? What is it about the suites that resonates so deeply with modern listeners? Is it something inherent in the works themselves, or in their manner of realization, or in their creator? The answer I propose is a combination of all three. First, I think the restrictions that were placed on Bach in choosing to write for the cello, polyphonic instrument, or polyphonic music for a single voice instrument, resulted in works that transcend his time and place, and to speak clearly, in our time and place. Since Bach was obliged to pare away material from his inner conception of the works and to result that was both playable and complete, the cello suites have a purity and simplicity of construction that's rare even among Bach's works. Bach's works are universally acknowledged for their complexity. They're never superfluous, but they're always complex. This music is amongst his least complex on the surface. It's amongst some of his most complex, I think, underneath the surface. And this is music reduced to its most elemental. Sculpture which has been refined and polished and beaten down into the most fundamental aspects of its meaning. Considerations of style and era, the things that tend to bind a work of art into one particular sort of interpretation, have given way here to the purest expression of a technique, counterpoint. These are the tracings of natural relationships that have not and will not change. This is not, this is what I mean by this is not music that is sort of a particular style, but counterpoint is something that if a composer is going to write 600 years from now, they're going to deal with intermelodic relationships in the natural world. This is how waveforms work. Second, the choice of a single cello for the physical realization of music has had a profound impact, I think, on the popularity of cello suites. The cello is sculptural, it's human-sized, it's made of natural materials, it's made of maple and spruce, and French rosewood on the pegs, which is almost extinct, and ebony on the fingerboard, which is from South America, and Pernambuco on the bottom button, and Pernambuco on the bow, which is an endangered species of tree in Brazil. The bow and the fingers are readily observed. The actions of the cellist impact directly on the instrument to produce a sound. I think a cellist has a much more intimate and immediately perceived relationship with what is actually happening than, say, a pianist does, for example. There's a lot of mechanism between a pianist and the sound. There's a lot of mechanism between an organist and the sound. That's not to say you can't see the finger going down and the note coming up, but there's a greater intermediate. How did that note come out over there with the finger? On a cellist, you see this happening. I think that's a very personal experience. And the singularity of one player on one instrument, I think, is very personal. And we live in a world that is involved in the individual at the moment. The symbiotic relationship of the player and the instrument, held in a position that creates a human-scaled, solid physical presence, is both approachable and austere. Chair, cello, cellist. Perhaps, in the end, it's no great surprise that great humanitarians such as Casals and Rostropovich have been able to employ the symbolism of the cello to awaken others to the fundamental humanity of mankind. Finally, I think there's something about Bach himself that speaks to our modern times. I think Bach used the most rational, intellectual, and in a way inflexible system in art. Actually, counterpoint, I think, could be argued to be the most rational system in art, to produce some of the most significant artistic creations of Western culture. In Bach, the human, emotions, feelings, intellect, the rational, not only in terms of human rationality, but in the actual rationality of the materials he's working with, counterpoint, and the transcendent, which I think takes into account not only what these notes mean to the perceiver's brain, but Bach's own sense of transcendency, meet to produce monuments, musical monuments that pay homage to the natural world, the heights of human reason, the depths of human imagination, and the relationships that connect all these things. Bach was and remains, I think, for us, a modern man. Okay. So what I'd like to do next is I'm going to play a few little excerpts of pieces to sort of show what it's like to hear the counterpoint in a way. Deferred counterpoint would be the most obvious. Implied counterpoint is actually quite difficult to show. the easiest to hear would be deferred counterpoint. I don't want this to get terribly technical, and I also think at some level it doesn't matter too much. If Bach wasn't disturbed by the fact that he was dependent on us to complete his text, then if we miss some of his text, I think that's okay. But just to get a sense of what's going on. I've chosen 3 different courants, fast movements. This is the courant of the first suite. Yeah, we can zoom that. I can zoom it if you like down here. Yeah, there we go. Here, let's just get to the first line, because that's the obvious. Let's just make it slightly smaller.
Slightly small.
Here, I can do it. There we go. Okay, perfect. What you see looks like a single line of music. I'm going to try to sort of draw a couple of lines for you so you can see. This is from this first suite. So, I'm just going to sort of draw it out a little slowly for you here. If you take a look at this, the first 2 notes are accompanied by this. So we have this line, ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum, ya-da-dum-bum-bum, ya-da-da-da-da-da-dum. So there's an accompaniment line built into this, and it ends up sounding like this. You see what I'm talking about? Yeah. The second example is the courant from the fourth suite, or the third example actually. This is actually, what I just showed you is 2 voices. This is actually 3 voices.
How far along are you playing in this?
Not very far.
Okay, just for those who.
Once again, it looks much like a single voiced composition. And this is the one that was in Elena's handwriting as well. So I'm going to show you the 3 voices. There's 1 voice, 2nd voice, 3rd voice. So you have, here are the 3 voices. There's the first voice, 2nd voice, 3rd voice. Now this is 2nd voice, 1st voice. 1st voice, 2nd voice, 3rd voice, 3rd voice, 2nd voice, 1st voice, 3rd voice, 2nd voice. Put it together, sounds like this. So you hear the voices. So the last example I'm going to show you is the 3rd courant. I may end up playing this in its entirety if I can actually play it decently enough. A moment. This one has 4 voices, though it will appear to be the most straightforward and simple. So on the page, this looks probably the simplest of them all. It has 4 voices in it, not 2, not 3. So here's the first verse. Answer. Oh, sorry. I'm in the wrong key. Answer. 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 First voice. Second voice. Third voice. Fourth voice. First voice. Second voice. First. Second. Third. Fourth. let's see if you can follow voices as it goes. One example of implied voices. This one is a little bit, this one I think will work.
So we have 4 voices?
That one had 4 voices, yeah. Here's an example of implied voices. This is a Sarah in the second suite. You're going to hear a melody that goes like this. Oh, sorry. And you're going to hear an accompaniment that does this. And you're going to hear that together. The floor.
No, that was beautiful. In the range of why and how this came about and how our concerts have come about, I realized that I had been describing sculpture as music in plastic space and music as sculpture in elastic space. We didn't include, when we were doing the original writing down, the way that the insights came about was that Karun came and he said, you know, we should really write this up. And he got me talking for about 2 days steadily. And he interpreted it over about 6 months, I think. And that's how we got it. And we didn't really add counterpoint to the insights, partly because it was just so automatic to me to be talking about that when I was in front of the pieces that I didn't think twice about it. It was one of the difficulties of abstracting sculpture and, in a sense, abstracting art, visual arts, especially painting and sculpture, that the strength of artists and what they got paid for so many years was their ability to do analogies prior to the photograph coming along. And I was always amazed how liberated music was from basically the Gregorian chant. I would have to say, as a sacred music and a complete music, the Gregorian chant pretty much did it. So the question was why ever progress beyond that? And music did a much faster jump into the sense of abstraction and being able to do multiple voices than either sculpture or painting at that time, because there was the artists, the painters and sculptors were paid to create analogs, in a sense. It's their analogical strength that allowed them to get paid. And so when we see metaphor in painting and sculpture, most often it's when they're on their own sacred path and not being paid to do things. So the liberation of music always fascinated me, that it was able to go to multiple voices long before painting or sculpture ever could. And, you know, now we take it for granted that people can look at abstract paintings or abstract sculptures, but in fact, 25, 30 years ago, it was, what's that? That's one of the reasons why the pop art that we look at was so easy for people to grasp it. And that was almost part of the irony that the people who were doing it wanted to say is hey, you know, what they'll really buy is advertising. And in a sense, the strength or not of painters and sculptors all those years was really doing the advertising for the aristocracy. They were, in a sense, immortalizing them. So the liberation of painting and sculpture, especially in the 20th century, and freeing it from the boundaries that we're holding it into, in a sense, a single voice, and it had been done much, much earlier in music. And so, in looking at the progression of sculpture over that particular period of time, I realized that things happened in different timelines, and different timelines in art. So, when showing the work, so it isn't just in showing the work and discussing counterpoint. Counterpoint to me was the essence of actually liberating art, painting, and sculpture from the actual boundaries of how it was held over all of those centuries. So I became really enamored with music at the time when it broke away from the boundaries of just the limits of setting sacred music and the human voice itself, and then freeing it to these multiplicity of voices that come in music. It was easier for strings to do this earlier. I have seen a show on earlier instruments, and one of the problems with that is that the horn makers and the flute makers and the oboe makers were all doing it however they felt like it sounded. So about the only thing you could really play in tune were strings. So there's this great explosion in the Baroque period of counterpoint, and I think part of it is that the instrument makers were allowing for multiple voices to actually play together well. And so in coming to this particular point in time, I felt so strongly that the way that sculpture would evolve has evolved in terms of its counterpoint. And this work that I've been working on, especially since 1980, really deals with some very fundamental levels of it. So in coming up to this particular point, the sculpture suites, the cello suite seemed to me, the cello suite seemed to me so much speaking to the stage and particular area where the sculpture unfolded for me as it unfolded out in the field. So as I take and have taken people through, I refer to counterpoint because so many more people, when coming around sculpture, are significantly more aware of and have taken music lessons and at least some of the principles of counterpoint. But I've always assumed that they would get it. So I've shown people how to look around and move around the sculpture in a certain way. What I have, when we had the chance for Brian to come up here, a wonderful thing happened. We could bring these things together, and finally someone who really could write about counterpoint actually did write about counterpoint. So we had asked him to write about counterpoint for this forum, and then bring the music in later as part of this, in a sense, of opening people's eyes and opening people's ears so that what was there could be seen from both perspectives, the sculpture in elastic space and the music in plastic space. So to bring those things together. So we're very, very lucky that he not only is a terrific musician, he's also a terrific writer. So he's written some wonderful things on counterpoint. And I just would like to point out that we've been handling analogs and metaphors throughout this conversation, and how they're utilized throughout the language in very, very many different ways. In art, in my opinion, and in the way that I've approached the sculpture that I do, and the way that I really do believe Michelangelo approached his sculpture as well, is in the concept of counterpoint. How one aspect of something meets another aspect until you have a multiple of voices and until the sculpture comes together. Now, the interesting part about music, the way that it is, and this is why I wanted to have this in front of us and then Brian play it, was that when Brian looks at this, he's looking at the analogs. This music is analogs. That's all that it is. The notes are analogs. They're graphs, they're staffs, they're graphs. They may look semi-pretty to a visual state, and some of them are done better than others in terms of their visual aspect of it. But these analogs, as music got written, and these things could be done in terms of, it was a language, because until the instruments could play together, there was no point in writing much up here. So I would guess that the actual writing of music and Baroque music comes very, very, very much on the same time.
Yeah, the science of notation was completed in the Baroque period.
Yeah.
We're still using this same
Right. So now a magic thing happens. And so this is the magic that we've just had in front of us. The analog is here. The analog is a historical reference that comes from 250 years ago. And there it is. Now, for those who can read music, then perhaps you can look at it and listen to it while you're looking at it. And certainly, we know that when Beethoven composed, that's what he was doing, especially when he was deaf. But when Brian looks at that, the first thing that happens is he hears that visual thing. And now that analog goes through one stage to the next stage, which is he can look at that and actually hear it. Now that may seem odd in some ways, but it's not really odd in terms of the spoken word. The spoken word is spoken, then it's written, and then we hear it when we look at it. But what's interesting about this particular analog is it's pure analog. It was done only for this purpose. It attaches to itself no other metaphor in and of itself. So now it has to go through a transformation. He sees it, he hears it, he plays it. Now there are people who will never be able to move that analog into the realm of the art that was there. So he releases from this analog, he releases this into the art itself. And in that transformation between analog and bringing the analog to it, and bringing himself to it, he then liberates the art, and he liberates it to art. The art lies in the polyphony, it lies in that counterpoint. So he then brings that alive, and that is in the essence of what I see a sculptor doing, and this is what I see in how we move from these analogs. So when things come into my studio, they come in as gray, nothing thing. If it's stainless steel, it's that. If it's sandblasted steel, it's nothing. It looks like nothing. So it is, and that was the way I wanted to start all of these works, so that you start from the analogical, and then you then move to the metaphorical, and in that counterpoint, you realize art. And so I think that we've reached the parallel, and the most interesting part about this, which is I really hold to, and why I've used a unitary statement as to what art is that music is not really, musical art and sculptural art and literature are not really analogs of each other. They really do form this one aspect of an approach to human consciousness. And I hope that we've brought that thing together. I really feel it very, very strongly that we did do that. And I hope that other people have all perceived that we get used to seeing things in very isolated and separated ways, and we see one thing to be analogous to another and then automatically differentiated. In the case of art, in the case of consciousness, I really do think that they do form one unity in that thing, the active will and in accord with the mature conscience. And I think that that's where that can go. So that brings it all around. So that's so go ahead.
Well, actually, I just thought perhaps we could extend, I guess, part two of the discussion we started earlier. And there are so many valuable lessons here, I think, and it's true. I mean, artists in the visual realm, especially painters, have for a long time tried to capture the experience of listening to music. Kandinsky is probably one of the most famous examples, and maybe one of the difficulties is that he has a single plane, and he's trying to present an entire composition in one frame, basically. But I wonder, maybe from your perspective, because this is the question I'm always asking, the lessons maybe you've drawn from this, how exactly do we address the viewer? I mean, obviously, as you're saying, the viewer completes the work in a way, but not just the viewer looking at a single work of sculpture, but maybe in the presentation of the sculpture in an educational context.
You mean the listener in my context?
Yeah.
Well, it's true confessions time. I kind of resent the listener.
That's why it's so difficult.
On a few levels.
But then you are the listener, as you said.
I am a listener. I am a listener. Earlier today, when we were talking about the artist's sort of what was the term used about the sort of not debt to ancestors, but one's connection to one's ancestors, or one's obligation to one's ancestors. I feel an obligation to Bach. In this particular instance, I feel an obligation to Stravinsky if I'm playing Stravinsky. Doesn't matter. I feel an obligation to the audience insofar as my obligation to Bach or Stravinsky means that they had better get Bach or Stravinsky, which means that I had better execute it well enough that happens. I resent the audience because inevitably, and including today, the audience brings down my level of execution. Always sound better at home. Always sound better alone. You should have heard me here last night. Wow, it was fabulous. If I didn't like the way I played it first, I just went straight back and played it again. It was brilliant the next time. So there's an unfortunate aspect of music that freezes it into time, which I think is as frozen as Kandinsky had to deal with freezing something into a frame. It's frozen into a particular performance. I don't think that Western classical music, well, any music, but pop music doesn't depend upon the written text the way Western classical music does. I don't think music, my kind of music, has actually come to grips yet with what that means. And the problem is the recording technology, the CD, the MP3 file, freezes a performance into time. The way musician artists have dealt with that problem is called digital editing. And we get to freeze into time perfection. All the things I didn't like just now, which are probably just about one per bar in my own particular instance of how I was playing, can be edited. I remember the experience of doing a demo. I did a demo disc several years ago, and it was allowed to be edited. It was sort of for a purpose of not a commercial purpose, but it wasn't like I didn't have to be an audition or anything like that. I was allowed to edit this thing. And I remember bemoaning to the editor that, you know, I mean, we recorded 45 minutes of music, and it was like 32 edits in this. It's just like, how, you know, why is it so, like, why can't I do better than this? And he said, this is nothing. He said, I just finished doing a 1 hour CD for somebody that had 250 edits in it. So 1 hour of music had 250 edits.
So do you think?
So there's an edit every few seconds.
Yeah.
So that's the way we've dealt with that issue, the issue of the audience. And I think it's the problem the painter has with the frame. When it comes to live performance, the frame is the temporal time. The frame is from the time I play the first note to the time that I play the last note. And that's why I resent the audience. But, having said all that, I wouldn't make a living without an audience, and I think that there's no point in this music being played just for me. I think that if one's going to learn a cello suite, one should then go and perform it. Presuming one plays it, well, I was going to say well enough, but maybe that doesn't even count. In a postmodern perspective, that doesn't count. In a pre-postmodern perspective, well enough counts a lot. So, I think that I have an obligation to the audience to actually show up and play. And I think I have an obligation to Bach to find an audience for him. So I think I'm stuck in between. And if I'm going to identify myself as a musician artist, there are those obligations I have to live up to. And they come from both directions. Does that go anywhere to answering your question?
Mm-hmm. Can you maybe provide some insight or do the work of translating those insights for sculpture?
For sculpture or painting? Maybe it would have some parallel in subject matter, which we have touched on. We touched on that with pop art. And one of my questions for your paper in the back of my mind as I was reading it is, if we go back, if we push the restart button and start again at a certain point in art history, what is appropriate subject matter? Or another way to put it, is there anything that's out of bounds? So if pop art is an issue, if pop art is essentially devoid of meaning, does that mean that we can no longer include a picture of a Buick in a piece of art? I don't know. Is that out of bounds? I mean, if you're going to have appropriate subjects, then you have inappropriate subjects. So, in terms of visual or sculptural art, I just think that perhaps the approach would be somewhere along the lines of the artist having an appropriateness of symbol or structure. I don't know what that appropriateness is deeper than just, Michelangelo's Pieta is meaningful to us because it's Christ and the Virgin, but it's also a mother and a child. It's also a living and a dying. So, I mean, there's layers of subject matter. It doesn't have to be Christ and the Virgin. It could be an African mother with a starving child. I mean, it could be somebody cradling somebody who's died in a car accident or dying from a car. I mean, the subject matter can be moving no matter what the actual subject is. So I don't think that, I'm not trying to say that the subject matter has to be something specific or propaganda-ish or even...
But you're talking about the internal work.
I'm talking about the internal work. The internal work has to have something of value to make it worth perceiving. I think that's the artist's obligation to the audience. So, for example, I don't know much about modern art, but I don't think there's much value in perceiving bags of potato chips being crushed and emptied out over the top of the sky. I don't know. Maybe it was very beautiful. It could have been like confetti. I don't know. I mean, when Christo wraps plastic around islands, I can't decide if I think it's incredible or if I think it's absolutely stupid. I don't know. half of me looks at the pictures of it and thinks, wow, that's incredible. And if it's incredible, it's moving me somehow. So maybe it's valid. I don't know. So I think the subject matter and the validity of the subject matter is very hard to pin down. And probably varies from case to case and perceiver to perceiver and artist to artist. But that might go. I don't know. I've said enough.
So, Jerry,
I got a lot of proto questions.
Proto question.
And they're around, you said the same thing about Bach that Beethoven said about himself,
Absolutely.
Glass said about
Yeah.
himself.
Yeah.
And that I kind of said that Jeff was saying,
Mm-hmm.
that you're mapping something that's there
Mm-hmm.
already. And I don't know if that's what you mean by subject matter when you talk about Beethoven.
Maybe. Yeah.
There's the question of with music surely, because it's been said often enough. There's something there that's being recorded.
Yet
And
there's no subject matter.
there's no reference.
Yeah.
And the mathematics of counterpoint refers to something having to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
Although not all Beethoven didn't always write
Yeah.
counterpoint, but he heard something. And after a fashion, Jeff's sculptures are representing something in his proto-experience. When he gets it right, he has reproduced what he's seen. The language doesn't hold as clearly for that as it does for music. Well, then I think about text, and then immediately I said, I read this thing. I could read it well, I could read it badly, and I could cough while I'm reading it. And I know my reading of it, my verbal presentation of it is different than someone who's reading it themselves, because I add things. I communicate on multiple channels when I'm reading it. Voice, tone, and gesture. Lots of stuff. And it's like I heard something, and my performance of the text can get it right better than my just the writing of the text. So I can almost say the same thing about textual art as about musical and about. But that's why I say I've got a lot of proto questions. I just focusing on this. There's something here. Well, and I tried to articulate it in talking about maps of the human soul. Music is a map of the human soul. Visual arts are maps of the human soul. In some way, discourse is a map of the human soul. That there's something there, here, in potentia, at the minimum, that we're all trying to reveal, so that the viewer, the listener, can recognize it, or recognize themselves in it.
thank you. You want
Let's see if there are any-
okay, no, I think, okay, you have a question. Sure. Jeff, go ahead.
In reference to your conversation, the one part we haven't touched on, which pop art really does touch on, and it's one of the aspects of maybe a continuum, maybe not, I'm not sure. When we use the word entertainment, we're talking about how to fill in some time, right? Which is a strange thing, because for people who are serious about making art or doing art, time is a constraint. What the hell are you being entertained for? Why are you trying to kill time? So for people who are trying to kill time doing something, entertainment fits that, suits that. Going to the World's Fair is a matter of killing time. I don't know why people want to kill time. I have a very hard time even thinking about killing time, but that's what entertainment means. So when you go and veg out in front of a television set, you're really killing time. So there's an aspect of crossing over into the killing of time and the living of time. And I think that's a very important thing. What we were listening to here was living time, right? Time from the past, time in the future. The Buick is about dying time. It was conceived in dying time, it is viewed in dying time, and its life is dead time. So we can say, is it a valuable statement for art? Only in the ironic sense. Okay, so, you know, the irony of it is the very pathetic nature of killing time, right? So I think that that's a very important aspect of it, why it can't slide easily into the potato chip question. It's the potato chip bags are about killing time. The people in the stadium who witness this thing are there to kill time. And what does this do? This kills their time while they're killing time. So I have to say that if anything about art that versus these two things, is art is about living time, not about killing time.
Musicians beat time.
Yes, and I spent an awful lot of time. I spent an awful lot of time playing with people who are from time.
No wonder you resent
Absolutely, there it is.
Whenever I play with the Vancouver Symphony, there's one cellist who I often sit with, and inevitably, before every concert, he looks out at the audience, he looks back at me, and he says, I don't know why all these people are here. I wouldn't be here if I didn't have to be on stage.
One of the things I wanted to ask you, Brian, is if you could kind of explain the concept of implied harmony or implied melodies. Because there's sort of indicators of them, and then the listener's ear fills those in.
Yeah.
And Jeffrey's sculpture and lots of art uses it. This is a very common thing in art to use the concept of negative space.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to just reflect on the concept of implied, the implication of something, the use of negative space as a counterpoint. And I wonder if you could kind of comment on the power of that and why you would use that.
I think it certainly is parallel to negative space. I think that, on very practical terms, purely pragmatic artistic terms, it happens in the Bach cello suite just because it has to happen. Bach wants to complete a harmonic line, but he can't have it going all the time. So he is obliged to just stick those notes in every so often. And the space in between, like every so often you hear a low note, and then it might take a second and a half before you hear the next low note. Well, those two low notes are intimately connected to each other. They're forming a line of music. If I were to play low note to low note to low note, you'd hear a complete line. If I were to play low note to low note, you may occasionally hear an incomplete line, and then if I played you the middle voice harmony, you'd recognize that middle voice harmony should have been harmonized with a D in the bass, and oh, look at that, if I played that D in the bass, that would complete the missing line. So there are places where, if you understand music theory and construction, you can reconstruct. As I said earlier, I do that for my students. I will often play, like the saraband that I played, the second saraband, I play a complete second line to that movement when I play with my students. I have them play the upper line only and leave out all the chords, and I actually play constantly throughout the whole movement, filling in all the implied possibilities of bass line. So I think it's in the case of this, it's just a pragmatism.
Because he chose this for a specific reason. He chose to do it. I mean, why didn't he just compose it for a bunch of cellos or a bunch of instruments?
Absolutely.
He chose it for a reason. So obviously, you can't, unless you're second guessing, why do that? It's like saying, why only compose in one material when you could do it in a variety of different things and it'd make the perfect shape.
Absolutely. Yeah, but why would a painter choose to not make a sculpture?
Well,
it may have something to do with their abilities or their proclivities, but at some level too, you are constrained by the medium you've chosen to work with.
But why would you choose to be constrained? Is the question.
Maybe a friend asked him to write some cello suites for him. I don't know.
That's good.
Just a small observation that quite often bass line was written in, you just write continuo, so it was kind of the improvisational line.
Yes.
Maybe he's letting us improvise.
Somewhat, actually,
In mind.
sort of. It was the continuo, the improvisational part of a continuo. For those who don't know, continuo was a compositional process and structure in Baroque music. It means to have a continuous accompaniment. But the way it was actually composed, and this becomes kind of interesting, I'll employ some nomenclature here. There's a very common genre called a trio sonata, and despite what you might think, a trio sonata requires 4 players. And the reason is because the trio sonata has 3 lines of written music. Trio sonata for 3 lines. But it has a basso continuo, which is the bottom line of written music, but an inner line of implied harmonies that are actually indicated by the composer numerically. So you'll see a bass note written, and you'll see 6/5 written above it, which is just a measurement of the interval space above what that note should have. And then you'll see another bass note written, and you'll see 4/2 written above it. You see another one written, you'll see a 5 above it. And good harpsichordists, or lute players, or organists can instantly imagine what those harmonies, those intervallic harmonies written above, are implying, and play a middle voice line inside that, which would be different every single time the piece is played. So the improvisatory aspect of continuo playing is in the middle voices, not the bottom line. But I do think that what you're saying, probably, I mean, Bach probably couldn't avoid that because he wrote piles and piles and piles of music that required continuo playing. So I think that's probably an element of it. Yeah. I think that, I mean, to answer your question, why would you choose restrictions? Michael may wish to speak to this more, but I'll give a very brief example. My wife and I renovated our house. We bought a little 1928 bungalow, and we took off the roof and built it into a 2-story house. I designed the renovation. I drew the plans. And in drawing the plans, I had to go up into the attic and measure the attic. And I had to go down to the main floor and measure where a staircase might happen to go. And I had to sort of figure out where the structural walls of the existing structure were. And then I discovered in the attic that there's a chimney, damn it, right in the middle of the house. And the resulting floor plan that I came up with had to take into account all these restrictions. But it was actually easier in the end for me, not being a trained architect or not even really knowing anything beyond my grandfather was a house builder and I helped my dad build a few cottages, so I sort of know what the blood and guts of building a building are. Those restrictions made it possible for me, a very little architectural imagination, to actually come up with a floor plan that worked. If somebody just gave me a plot of blank land and said, build me something, like happened for this building, there's endless possibilities. But the architect starts looking for restrictions. Well, what's the slope? What are some of the natural, well, there's a mountain over there. There's an ocean over there. Okay, I think I have to align this a certain direction. So restrictions or boundaries become creative catalysts as opposed to things in the way, I think. You want to say anything to that?
Oh, absolutely. I don't know if it's part of I know it's part of my training, I don't know if that's the only reason, but because we operate in the world, and on this planet, where the sun comes up and goes down, and the wind blows, and there are trees, there's slopes, there are different, more subtle aspects to the landscape. This building, for instance, is much more about the landscape than it is about anything else. And that was, when Jeff and I started on this project, that was one of the givens. So it was, and always in my work is a matter of getting to know the landscape and listening to what God has to say. That begins to set up this subtle network of restrictions, as you say. And without those restrictions, it's kind of, I feel lost.
You can remember anything. Who knows what? Yeah.
It's biased to call them restrictions. It
It's a pejorative.
It presumes a particular attitude.
They're negative.
Practice, right?
Yeah.
Practice, right?
Well, Well, okay,
I usually call
sure,
it
that's better.
Parameter.
But I do it a little even differently. A creation is a response to a set of conditions. So I say conditions, not even constraint, not restrictions, not even constraint, conditions.
Yeah.
What have I got to work with? I'll pick my material. Or
Which is-
whatever you pick, that's what you create out of.
Which is always going to exist.
Which is
I mean-
necessarily.
Bach could have continued to expand to the hugest orchestra he could fit onto a stage, but then he still got the constriction of the stage.
There's a point though, yeah, go ahead.
I wanted to ask a different question.
Okay. Let's finish this discussion and we'll go on. I think that my point is that there's a definite spirit that you hear in the music you don't see there, and that somebody lesser that's just scraping around on that you wouldn't evoke. So to me, in your paper that you explore the concept of container and the inside and the outside, and to me, it's really important to create, and I'd like to explore the concept of what is inside the space that's implied, because there's certain kind of sacredness to something you don't touch, but you touch on, and because you can map up to it, you can kind of get close to it, but it's a very powerful, to me, way of saying something really profound. If you just go out and say something really profound, you're, carving it with a chainsaw, and then there it is, very ugly. But if you, come up but lightly onto it, and use, that's why I'm interested in this concept of, well, there's a purposeful reason why we use these, constraints or conditions, and we impose them, because it gives us the discipline, and it allows, I think it might allow the viewer or the audience a way in. Anyway, that was just.
I have a little phrase I use for myself and sometimes with my students in the metaphor of a map. I'm saying getting up to touching something but not actually being there. If somebody asks me, well, why or this or how did that work? I say, well, there be dragons. It's like from the medieval maps, with the water pouring off the edge, and here lie dragons. That's where the dragons are. We don't know why.
All right, Leva.
I was curious, after the conversation about the peninsular individual today and the kind of nervous system yesterday, if you could talk a little bit about counterpoint with multiple instruments and what that might say about collaboration or some kind of collaborative relationship.
Well, I play a string quartet, so I can say a lot about relationships in music. I play a string quartet with 3 women, so I can say even more about that. That's a very interesting dynamic. I think music in the context or in a symphony orchestra, I was thinking in terms of a symphony when I was listening to the peninsular individual, one who was part of something yet distinct. I've sat on stage with 104 musicians, and I've been part of something yet I've been distinct. I think that music has a lot to say about collaborative possibilities for humanity overall. I think getting there from here is very difficult. I think it's an analogy that's too simplistic to be useful at some fundamental level. Just to say, oh well, an orchestra that can play together, or well, forget the orchestra because there's a conductor who's a dictator. So forget the orchestra. A string quartet that can play together. There is no dictator. There are still conditions, so to speak, of collaboration and cooperation, and that is the text you're dealing with. If Beethoven has written something certain, I don't know how many of you have read Unequal Music by Vikram Seth. It's about, in that particular novel, there's musicians in the string quartet. Don't believe a word of it when it comes to how you rehearse together. It's all about, they're talking about the deep concepts of the music and blah, blah, blah. And if you came inside in on a rehearsal, you'd hear things like, well, who's the dominant voice there? Like, well, how loud should you be? Like, well, I gotta listen to you because you've got the moving line, and oh, look at that, they got past it. It's very pragmatic. Musicians are the most pragmatic artists there are, I think. Musicians hardly ever talk about emotions in music. Never, almost. Which seems odd to the non-musician. They should think that's all we should be talking about. Professional musicians of a high caliber who understand that the emotion will just happen, talk about the nuts and bolts of constructing it. So I think that the text then becomes a higher purpose of the four musicians. The four musicians are collaborating, but they're not collaborating like a focus group is collaborating, trying to see who has the best idea, or how should we move forward from here. They're collaborating on an authority that's been placed in front of us, and the authority is the text that's been placed in front of us. So Beethoven has placed something in front of us, say, or I played a Dvorak's quartet just 2 days ago before I came up. Dvorak placed something. So that's why I say I think it's a simplistic model for collaboration, because the players involved have already decided to defer to something beyond the four of them. Now maybe in terms of becoming Gaia's brain, or I mean perhaps there is a model there, perhaps the deferral is to the better health of Gaia, say. But there's problems of scale. There's a reason why there's a conductor in front of an orchestra, right? And there's issues of scale. And issues of scale eventually become unsurmountable. They just do. They just practically, I mean, if you could expand an orchestra, you know, multiple times and play on the field of GM Place, but at some point the guy at the back can't see the conductor. So then what? You know, put up big video screens, and but then there's a sound issue now. The trombones are 100 feet that way, or well, I'd like them to be 100 feet that way. The trombones are 1,000 feet that way, even better. But so is that going some direction to what you're asking?
Yeah, but in particular, I was interested in the idea of counterpoint, and so if there are more.
Well, it's all relational. I mean, I think that counterpoint is. To me, counterpoint is exceedingly specific technical piece of terminology in my business. Counterpoint as a metaphor, as I think Jeff probably uses it more often, is something else. So, my string quartet is a new string quartet. We've been together for not quite a year and a half, and we're made up of 2 people from Taiwan and 2 people from Canada, 3 women who are 30, 31, and 32, and a man who's just turned 42. Yet we have been praised repeatedly for having a beautiful sound, and there's something there. There's something about the 4 of us that's just there. And that may be something along the lines of the counterpoint that you're talking about, which is how does a collaboration become greater than the sum of its parts? And there be dragons, I don't know.
You gonna play anymore?
Does anybody else have a comment? Okay. Well, I'd really like to thank Brian and thank you so much for the dialogue. It's about, 3 o'clock, so we're doing not so bad. I just wanted to thank officially now the observers for joining us. It was really great to have an audience. And also the good questions and the good energy that we had. I think we'll continue to have an audience. We're going to just take probably a quick break, about 20 minutes, where we can say our goodbyes. And those who are presenters and participants, if you could just stay around for a little while, once everyone has had a chance to pack up, we'll do a little bit of a brainstorm.